Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's important webinar. This webinar actually is the second CETL Digital Learning, the New Normal webinar series. And the webinar title is Scaling Adaptive Courseware Through Best Practices. I'm Hassan Selim, the CETL Director. And before I present our speakers, allow me to link the webinar topic to the UAEU strategic plan. As you all know, the university strategic plan is anchored on 7 priority areas. 4 of them are core, and the other 3 are enablers. The second priority area is simply to provide high quality adaptive programs on campus. We haven't had adaptive programs or adaptive courses till this moment, as far as I know. Within that second core priority area about adaptive learning, there are 4 strategic initiatives. The first is the adaptive program offering. And the second is about micro-credentialing and learning customization, which is the adaptive courseware part of it. The third is effective teaching and learning methods. And the fourth is about lifelong learning offering reinvention. And if you look at the title and the abstract of today's session, it fits nicely into those 4 strategic initiatives. And that's why I'm saying this is a very important webinar that I expect to open our eyes on how to adopt and scale the adaptive courseware on our campus. Now it's my pleasure and honor to introduce our today's 2 speakers. Professor Karen Vignare. She's a strategic innovator, leveraging emerging technologies to improve access, success, and flexibility within higher education. As Executive Director for the Personalized Learning Consortium at the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, APLU, Karen manages a network of universities committed to student success through personalization. She also oversees the adaptive courseware grant providing leadership and support to 8 pioneering universities, which are scaling adaptive courseware in introductory level courses. Karen previously served as a vice provost at the University of Maryland University College, the largest online public open access institution, where she led innovations in adaptive learning, student access, and analytics. Previous to that work, she served as Director of Project Planning and Implementation for MSU Global at Michigan State University, where she helped multiple units leverage emerging technologies in extension, non-credit programs, corporate settings, and research projects. She has published extensively on online learning, analytics, and open educational resources. She has a PhD from Nova Southeastern University and an MBA from University of Rochester, William Simon Business School. And our second speaker is Professor Megan Tesene. She is the Associate Director for the Personalized Learning Consortium at the APLU with Karen. Megan directs the Adaptive Courseware for Early Success grant for the Personalized Learning Consortium. In this role, she supports and collaborates with academic leadership from a variety of 4-year universities to effectively adapt and implement adaptive learning technologies. Her work centers on enhancing pedagogy, closing achievement gaps, improving accessibility, and ensuring that students from all walks of life have the support and sources and resources necessary to graduate. Prior to joining the APLU, Megan served as the Adaptive Learning Program Manager at Georgia State University. Based in the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, it matches the name of our center. She managed an interdisciplinary research project leveraging adaptive learning technologies across several gateway undergraduate courses. Megan is a social scientist by training, with expertise in qualitative and mixed method research. She has taught introductory and upper level courses at the University of Northern Iowa and Georgia State University. In addition to project management and sociological research, she has extensive experience in program evaluation, faculty development, instructional support, and active learning communities. She has a PhD from Georgia State University and an MA from the University of Northern Iowa. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. A recorded version of this webinar will be made available internally to participants. Without any further ado, I will turn the time to Karen and Megan.
Thank you, Dr. Selim. This is extremely exciting for us to hear about your strategic plan. We think that you guys are extremely forward thinking around how we have to prepare our students and how we have to learn to use these technologies and tools in a different way in order to promote both effective teaching and to build a multimodal approach to the variation in students we're trying to teach, whether or not those are lifelong learners, whether or not they need something as simple as what we would call and what's referred to in your strategic plan as a micro-credential, or whether or not we need a new entire adaptive program. Here in the US, I think what we would say is only about 1 or 2 universities, and typically Arizona State comes up to the top, have been experimenting for over 5 years. So we're all sort of in this new world together, which also gives us a way of thinking about this both as researchers and as practitioners. You already heard a little bit about who we are, and you already heard a little bit about the Personalized Learning Consortium. So I'm going to just dig in with the slide on digital learning. Megan, if you want to go to that next slide. So for those of you who are less familiar with where adaptive learning sits, you're all familiar at this point in time with the digital learning modalities. Maybe some of you have had to jump to these modalities because you had mostly been working with face-to-face courses. Digital learning, as many of you know, you're increasing the use. You're certainly the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, and many of you are also from the IT college, so you're very aware of using different types of digital tools. But in our courses, some of us had not been using as many of those tools. Most of us had set up worlds where online programs and online courses were coming out of a different set of programs, and in some cases even different colleges, right? And those online programs across the world really were a variety of those, but in the US, I would say for certain, a lot of that was about revenue generation. And more recently, have we been thinking about lifelong learning as the world has changed rapidly, and we know people need to be educated in terms of new opportunities, whether that be in computing or data science or microbiology. All of those things are possible when we can't actually get our students to come to the university. So access is very high. And in the US, we began to think much more about how do we get students to finish? And that required us thinking about online courses really as part of flexibility. So I will profess to not knowing your students as well as I know those in the US. But in the US, what often happens is by the time you reach your third or fourth year, those students often have to either work or have family responsibilities. So living the campus life becomes very, very difficult. And many of our students, this I do know as part of your history, many of our students are lucky enough to get internships and get off the campus in that way. But we want to continue their work to make sure they finish their education. So that's where sort of the neighborhood of online courses came. Well, what we really started doing with the adaptive work is recognizing that not only could they help us with both the online programs, the online courses, but the face-to-face courses where we needed a lot more student data on how our students are doing at a very micro level, almost a day-to-day level, where we could see their progress and then help them understand what it is they need to do in a way that actually gears them or heads them towards success. Megan, we can go to the next slide. So when we think about digital learning and gateway courses, by and large, our research, and I was a late PhD, so as a late PhD, I actually did work, I finished my PhD in 2012, and I did my work in online learning, and one of the things that my thesis was about was the difference between younger students, that is those under 21, and older students. And by and large, we found those younger students, even in 2012, did not have all the same skills that our older students did. When we think about that, it was difficult for us to think about using online in those foundation courses. But adaptive, while it is a digital tool, is not a fully online course. There are a very few places using a self-paced digital adaptive course. By and large, that's not our recommendation. And what we are attempting to show you is that while we wouldn't want to entirely phrase adaptive as ubiquitous, it is a tool that can be used in multiple modalities. And it's actually a tool that can be used better at our foundational course level. However, we are very, very interested in your strategic plan that also targets building out programs that are adaptive as well. So by using deep and extensive technology integration, that can go across your conventional face-to-face all the way through your fully online. And it is another way of thinking about sort of what we might call, enterprise learning throughout. And it's a way of thinking that our students, no matter how they come to us, we would have the same kinds of tools, both for them to practice with and allow us to see that information. Megan, if you want to jump ahead. So in the US, we are often defining the problem probably a little bit differently than you are in the United Arab Emirates, right? But our low income and minority students are generally not doing as well. And we know what that has to do with. That has to do with academic preparation. It doesn't always have to do with ability, right? In fact, we think there's a lot of ability in our low income and minority students that just haven't had the same kind of practice academically that our other students have. And in our world at the US, faculty teaching these intro courses are often either adjuncts or teaching assistants. And those types of faculty generally have not gotten as much kind of pedagogy training. And we could probably argue intelligently and civilly that often faculty have not gotten the kind of pedagogy training that we would like to see. The departments in this world of introductory courses are often not very well incentivized. In other words, we reward the creation of degrees and research in a way that is usually preferential than it is to those who are actually starting our students out on a very successful path. And it's important to understand that we also value the core of universities, which is about academic freedom. But in some ways, because we've gotten such a diverse student base, I think our institutional cultures really need to start thinking about faculty collaboration. And that actually holds true whether you're creating a adaptive course across multiple sections or whether you're creating an adaptive program. We know, for instance, that our colleagues over at Arizona State, when they created their new biology program that is adaptive, all 50 faculty in that department had to collaborate on their and we all have courses that lead up to programmatic values. But when you're doing this in an adaptive format, you're going to have to agree much more deeply about those learning outcomes and learning activities. And that requires a movement from academic freedom alone to faculty collaboration. So Megan, if you want to move forward. So for those of you that may not be as familiar, we like to tell you a little bit about adaptive courseware. And I think there's still strong variations. And I recognize many of you, again, are from IT and from engineering. And I think in ACM and IEEE, you'll find that there's a lot more focus on the algorithms than there is on the pedagogy. We focus much more on how this enhances our ability to teach more than we focus on the algorithms. But what we explain to those that are starting in this world, this is really a digital teaching tool that comes with instruction and comes with assessments, right? And these are scoped and sequenced to support, and in some cases it can support a module, but in most cases it's built out to support an entire course. And if you are going to build these tools from scratch, that is, you just use the software, then you will have to think about the content and the assessment in ways that you haven't typically thought about in the past. And one of the examples that I would give is typically to make the assessment engines in these kinds of tools work, we know you're looking at a variety of questions, that is, questions in the way that we think of assessments, right? So they could be multiple choice, they could be drop and drag, they could be all types of assessments. But the base of that assessment level gets you up to probably closer to what we think around, at least around 1,000 assessment questions in a regular early level course. That's what we know have been created in courses that are generally new and have enough depth in order to help our students move forward. So when you are creating these types of courses and not using those that already come pre-packaged, you have to think about the time that it will take and the resources that will take to make effective questions, right? So these are scoped and sequenced. And what that means is our students practice in them, and that as their practice turns into knowledge, that they move forward. And so each of those students, you can see student A, B, and C, will move forward in different ways, right? They may all start at different points. So in a mathematics tool like Alex has about, you don't have to use all of these, but I'm going to use their number, about 370 topics, right? And it is possible that one student starts with 150 already that they know, and another student starts with about 20 that they know. So their starting points would be mixed, and then they have to progress. So you recognize the one with 150 would get through the course in a quicker time period. And we have to think about what that means for our course structures as we move into adaptive programs, right? So that's what is personalized and nonlinear, right? Typically, we go in a week by week or a module by module fashion, and this changes that model directly. And what we think is so critical, yes, practice for our students, personalized learning for our students are critical, but it's so critical is for faculty to have this knowledge, right? So what this knowledge tells you is, where are your students progressing? And it actually has to be very important to faculty. And we'll highlight this later on. And what we mean by that is that usually means it has to be of a grade point value. Most of our better implementations use a grade point value of somewhere between 15 and 40% of the course value. That's valuable to students. Those of you who might be economists would understand that, right? And that's valuable to the faculty. And what that means is the faculty then pays attention to the data. The data then helps you modulate what you're doing in the class or how you might break up student groups. I think we had a couple of questions, Megan, so
yeah, I went ahead and responded to one of them,
okay.
But if you could address them as well. It's just a question about this working well with large student or large courses versus just small courses as well. So address course size as well as modality, if you want to add anything about that.
Well, I was going to say the data, yeah, and Megan's already said a little bit about this. The data that we have is actually, the differential is much higher in the large course section. And that is, we're seeing the impact in large course sections at a higher rate than we are actually in the small course sections. That's not to say it doesn't work in a small course. And by the way, those are typically defined here in the US as less than 40 is small, and anything above 40 is going to be larger. And of course, in the US, we have plenty of courses that run up to 600 or 1,000, but the majority of our large courses are just over 100, and that would be where we're seeing the impact. We can go ahead and move ahead, Megan. So I want to continue a little bit on the benefits for instructors, because this is where we think the power is, and it's also very different than the way we've taught. I was privileged to teach both as a full-time faculty for about 6 years in lower level business courses. And then I continued to teach as an adjunct for many, many years, and occasionally still do. And one of the things that I know is that I often got data maybe every week, maybe every couple of weeks. When it was online, I got more data about my students and how they were doing. But what we know from our research is that often we lose our students without really knowing it. And these tools, these automated assessments and analytics, give our students the ability to do this work almost immediately, right? And that gives us more real-time data. What we find is if we don't get students engaged in the coursework early, then we lose them, and it's very difficult for them to dig out of the below C or the F range, right? So what is important is then the instructors see how the students are doing, right, with that course material, and then the instructors can think about the ways that what they do in the classroom might change, right? And this means a considerable change for how we think about. Now, I recognize IT classes, math classes, chemistry, you know, many of these classes have been working on problem sets, or they've been working on labs, but many of them have still relied on lecture to do that versus thinking about students being involved in the learning immediately in the classroom. And that is a differentiator. There's a huge amount of research out there about having students involved, more involved in their own learning and with their own peers, how that can continue to motivate and build self-efficacy. So one of the huge opportunities about adaptive that we hear over and over from faculty is this has really freed up their time. And instead of talking about what the basics that they need to cover, that's where the software covers the basics, right? Like, so faculty will say things like, I don't have to refer to my glossary anymore, right? I don't have to give them the actual PowerPoint out of the textbook anymore, because they're ready when they come to class. But that readiness coming to class is really only when you've also made that grade point value valuable for both of those, right? Both the faculty and the person. We can go ahead, Megan. And the other side is really, why would institutions think about this, right? Institutions by and large, and I think this is true more so outside of the US than it is inside. We do have institutions in the US that are growing. They are mostly in our South over through our Western states, right? But many of our students' growth, because of our demographics, have actually slowed down quite a bit, right? And what that often means is that if you've got students who are not completing, in the US we say things like, our data shows that you have about 30 million students who have started with some college but never completed, right? That's bigger than our current market of students attending in any given year, right? So for us, it's also about getting and improving student success. And we know the more students you can get through that first year successfully, the more of them you get to complete, right? And that these tools are providing us with richer data. And that data we can begin to analyze in ways that prepare us essentially for learning with all these new tools. And almost all of our universities that have participated, because they're working with vendors directly, whether it's software vendors or whether it's publishers, they're actually reducing the costs of materials to students. So institutions are interested in these tools. One, because it allows them to serve a diverse population, and back to your strategic plan, your diversity in population may be around the fact that you want more students in your programs. At the same time, you want to think about who could tap into those programs to improve either through micro-credentials or lifelong learning. We can go ahead, Megan. So what does it take for faculty? And I think many of you on this webinar, and we're glad that you're here, have to recognize there is a significant amount of work before the course, and there is a change in how you teach the course, right? By and large, the faculty report, because we have some cases, and Megan will talk a little bit more about this later on, we have some cases where faculty were teaching with the new tools and then teaching with the old methodologies in other courses, right? And by and large, what we find is it takes more time to prep. Like all of you do prep, you did prep over your summer, but the prep required you to look at what's the software, what's the textbook, what is the customized tools, how am I going to go in and change what it is they know, what it is the tool is going to focus in for the students, and how does that integrate into my course. But the bigger change, like, and if you ever walk through an online course, you did a lot of that. Right? So if you've ever gone from your face-to-face course to your online course, you had to do a lot of this kind of prep work, right? But the bigger change is in the redesigned course approach. And that requires looking at data in ways that you have not done before. And it requires that you're almost, you're willing to listen to the data, you're willing to react to the data, versus having this expectation that every week my course does this, right? And that is a very different approach, right? Like, and we know this to be true. All of you are online because you're here. The same way we are, right? And you all know how all of the big company tools work, right? Like they all recognize your data set and they react according to that. That's very different than the way we've taught in the past. And this redesigned approach really takes some practice. You're really giving a lot of feedback and you're involving the students in their practice in ways that you haven't been able to do before. So I think we can kind of move ahead and start in our what we've learned throughout our Acceleration of Adoption Adaptive Courseware grant. So as you all probably know, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Bill Gates himself, has been very interested in how we change education to essentially educate more people, but also educate them in ways that they are more successful. And to do that in the US, he's really built around digital learning. And he's very interested in how do you scale that kind of digital learning tools. So one of the things that we would probably challenge you as an institution, not necessarily as faculty, but as an institution is, if you're going to meet your strategic goals, they also have to be fairly consistent in their targets, right? So one of the targets that we thought would be useful was how much of your credit has to change in order for you to build a base around understanding adaptive learning. And we came up with the foundation, 15% of all general education courses credits would actually use adaptive learning tools, right? And that means that when you think about this, we have wonderful faculty, and I'm sure that you are also those kind of faculty. We have plenty of faculty that choose to always innovate in their classroom, but that doesn't scale across all the sections, right? And one of the things that we have to think about is back to that nature of our work from being individuals in a very large system to being collaborators in a very large system, right? So now we have to think about scaling adaptive across all the sections of the course, right? And our goals were also about improving student success. What we did find is once this work gets started, it actually takes off quite well, right? That's not to say it's not hard, right? But we were targeted amongst 8 universities. I think our total should have been about 175,000 enrollments in the 3.5 years we had the grant. And instead we got about 250,000. So what we find are that once you have a successful pilot and you continue to say, we are scaling this work, we're going to continuously improve until we scale. And then when we scale, we continuously improve. And what that means is that faculty have some reassurance that this isn't going to be a required effort until it's actually working well, right? So that is also really important. And what we wanted to share with you is that not only do we have over 200 adaptive courses, there's 25 course disciplines, and we were using 15 different course vendors. Megan, if you want to move ahead, right? And for us in the US, the cost of attending university is incredibly high. We have moved from the university being basically a free public good to a private cost, right? And those private costs, we by and large assume prevent some people from attending. And if we continue to use that, it's not that people wouldn't invest, but they can't overinvest unless they have a degree, right? And so one of the things that we have to think about is as we've moved to more private financing, that is individual financing, right? We have to think about their success in each of these courses in order to reduce the full cost of tuition. So by having the kind of success that we have, we've saved students directly, not the institution, which you would have to think about, right? and the cost of over $12.5 million. And that is actually more than if we would have reduced the cost of their textbooks to zero, right? So I also know there's an open education movement. I've been part of it. I am part of it. But what I would tell you is in the 15 years of open education, we haven't seen the kind of student success. What we do is we see a lowering of cost, which again is an important part of this. But if we can't also have student success, we have to think about that as well. We can move on, Megan. So obviously you saw the millions achieved. We saw the course rates improving. We have, and I'm going to show you both Arizona State and I'm going to show you a little bit from Oregon State, just so you can see how they looked at these things differently, right? 66 of those 204 courses, and most of those 66 were the ones that were scaled for at least 3 years. Not all of those 204 courses scaled all 3 years, right? But when you practice this, again, 3 years of practice, 3 years to reach scale, 81% reported that higher ABC rate, right? And we are very aware that these tools work better within our STEM world, right? And by and large, we certainly see double-digit increases in math and algebra. There aren't as many good tools in calculus, I will certainly admit to that. We also have high success in biology, business, and even modern languages, which is a little bit interesting, right? But we're working here in the US right now on how do we build across maybe what's the framework for building a better writing course? So we know full well that we have to work in non-STEM courses as well. All right, why don't we jump to the next one? So I wanted to share a little bit about what Oregon State did. And Oregon State really focused on their math problem. Now, Math 111 for them is college algebra, right? And I grant you that college college calculus is also very predictive in this same kind of modeling for our STEM majors. And so we should think about that. But at this point in time, they were working with their college math. You can see if you were not successful in college math, the number of additional courses where you would have problems, right? And as a student, that means your pathway gets a lot smaller. And it means that the number of students who are likely to be successful are limited, right? So if you were successful in math, you're looking at 18 other courses that you would likely be successful in, right? And that amounted to 32% of their gen ed, right? So we have to seriously think about what are our predictor courses and how do we make them so so much better than they currently are. Megan, we can move ahead. So if we think about what they did with math in the early part of this, they were able to have 5,800 students move out of their DFWs and then move on to their other courses, right? And that 5,800 translated into over a couple of million of the dollars you've already seen in tuition savings. But for OSU, Oregon State, their population is mostly residential based. So it isn't that in the US, every single course costs $2,300, but when you book in room and board, you start to get a higher cost for these students. And when we looked at that tuition savings number, by the way, we only looked at tuition dollars. So our number, if you were a residential student, would have actually saved students even higher amount. So we can move on in Oregon State. Yeah, so they cut the withdrawal rates. This is the other thing that's actually really important, because oftentimes faculty face this churn in the very beginning of the semester because students don't exactly know what they're doing. Even though you may have perfected your lectures to some extent, without that additional practice, students get very like, I'm not really sure what we're doing in this class, right? Unless they've had experience with it, right? And that churn means that you lead to much higher withdrawal rates. They were able to actually decrease their rates for their online courses, because in the US as well, we have a higher rate of failure in our early online classes, not our graduate online classes. Our graduate online classes are highly successful, but we typically call those students who have already learned, right? And in general psychology, they also were able to reduce those rates. We can move on, Megan. And so you can see that their DFW rates, and one that actually might be very interesting for your population is that bottom one in terms of the international pathway. The adaptive learning was actually harder for a lot of international students. And what that means is we didn't see this success in it. And I know you have a very diverse international student base along with international faculty, right? And one of the things you're going to have to remember in your work of setting up adaptive is that each culture kind of comes with its own level of preparation. And that cultural change to using adaptive actually is going to take a little bit of time. Now, this was data, and you can see at the very bottom for those of you that are looking. And by the way, we will share these slides with Dr. Selim, and he can certainly not only use them in the recording, but send them out to you. That this was recorded in 2018, right? Since then, they have seen that the international student population is actually progressing a little bit better. But what that also tells you is that computer technology in the US for our entering students is actually pretty high, right? In other words, their access to computer technology, their use of computer technology in both school and at home is also pretty high. And that may not be the case across the world. We can go ahead and move on. So if you think about the impact of their redesign, that 2,300 amounted for those nearly 6,000 students, about $1.3 million in cost savings. Again, this was for the student, right? Not the institution. The institution received about $500,000 from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation over 3.5 years. But I would say it's fair to say that faculty have to be incentivized either with time, rewards that may or may not be monetary, right? But the institution will also, the more the institution relies on a collaborative approach, it's also going to need support for places like the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning that support faculty with instructional designers, right? But these faculty all talked about the student engagement and positive student experience, right? So one of the things that faculty by and large talk about in adaptive courses is they just notice a change in the way their students respond. Yeah, we can go ahead and move on, and I see a
Sounds good.
question.
We just got a question. So we have, in the US, international students are mostly from non-English speaking backgrounds. In the case of UAEU, it's different. So I agree with you, the results vary across the globe.
Yeah.
Comment.
I think that's very true. And honestly, I think the software is still built in an English speaking capacity. We could argue whether math is English in terms of the algorithms, but in terms of how it's interpreted, we could certainly think about that as probably something that might affect it. But what I want to make sure you understand is, even though the data showed there was no change, it wasn't a negative change, right? But after the international students had gotten used to the practice, they began to do just as well as other students that actually had come from the US. So this is Arizona State, and Arizona State has gone big into adaptive learning. They believe this is the way that they're going to keep growing. This is what they need in order to transform. Arizona State is not only interested in growth, it is also interested in student access and success. Dr. Michael Crow is very much a believer in his new book, The Fifth Wave of Universities. He believes that not only are we going to see mega universities, but we have to understand that our background as public universities really means that we must do a better job at student success, right? So it's not only bringing in our students, it's also helping them succeed. So they looked at all of these different programs, and I think it's really important to understand adaptive software, that bottom yellow highlight, gold highlight. Adaptive software is necessary but not sufficient to enable student success. And when Arizona State speaks about this, what they often say is it is active and adaptive. We have to move away from the lecture in the classroom. The classroom has to become more active, even if that classroom is online. So the adaptive begins to work on the lower levels of Bloom's, or what we might also refer to as the rote part of learning, where students are practicing the same thing over and over and over until they're ready to do higher level work. Megan, we can move on. So this is the Bloom's taxonomy that I was just referring to. And if you think about where is the adaptive learning really helping, and in the model for ASU, they really, faculty use the adaptive learning, and there's a difference. The math is different than other, and I'll explain the two differences, right? In the general subjects beyond math, the adaptive learning is assigned before students come to class. So now these students have the foundational knowledge and the foundational practice to now engage in other types of activities in the classroom. Typically that shows up as problem-based learning, right? Now, it may show up in peer-based learning. It may show up with clickers. It may show up in different ways that you could do this work. But essentially, what it is a continuation of more practice, and the practice is varied so that students learn language of the discipline in variable ways, right? So that's what's happening in that active classroom, so that they hear more things, they practice more things in the classroom, and that's moving away from the lecture, which generally can be done in these adaptive systems. Now, in the math courses, they're actually using laboratories where there's computers, right? So they have these open computer labs where courses are scheduled. And in these cases, these courses are scheduled and students come in and do practice. And the faculty have already thought about, okay, this group of students are struggling with this set of problems. They have a way of actually alerting through the computer technology the students that are having this set of problems will be brought over here and taken by either an instructor or a TA through another set of problems. So what they're doing in that classroom is not only the practice in the math tool, but the ability to take them out immediately, real time, have another set of practices in order to sort of break through those misunderstandings. And I think we can move on.
Yeah, we did have a quick question, and this comes up on campuses when we're visiting, Karen, is what's the role of high school here and how to coordinate with high school?
So in the US, I mean, and again, it varies because you can imagine we have a variation between poor and rich public schools. But we are finding more and more of the public schools to be using the adaptive work in math as well, right? So we're actually finding some students go to college having done adaptive work and their college doesn't use it, right? And we're also finding that coordination level allows us to begin to work with our high schools in showing them this is the work that they'll do in our math course so that we can begin to coordinate that preparation. And I think in some ways it also gets back to your university strategic plan, that if you happen to have a set of students that are coming in highly prepared, they will actually jump a little further into their program. So why don't we move ahead and show them some of the results. So if we think about biology in ASU, and ASU built this course from scratch with a company called Cogbooks. What that means is they went out and used open education resources, and then they built, they had to spend a lot of time building in the questions and the assessments, right? And these instructors, particularly led by a champion instruction, Susan Holchek, actually were able to reduce the withdrawal rate because, again, students knew what they were getting into much sooner, right? And they could decide whether or not to leave this class. And they were able to improve this. Now, again, this shows the numbers. It took about a couple of practices, that was spring, fall, spring, before you actually saw the increase in grades. So we can go to the next one because I believe that's their math course. This may have...
And we did have a question in the chat as well about how adaptive can also be used with advanced students in a course. I know a lot of the focus that we talk about tends to be about identifying at-risk students who are not doing well, but the benefit of these technologies is that it can also identify students who are doing quite well and accelerated. So Karen, do you want to talk about some of the models that folks have used to kind of work with some of those students?
Yeah, so actually we're much lower on using these well for advanced students than we are at using these well for developmental ed students. So with advanced students, essentially, if the advancement happens within a number of weeks where withdrawal is still happening, they can be bumped into a new course. But by and large, our ability to bump advanced students is actually difficult across the world right now. We're much better off at actually speeding up students who are further behind. That's our data at this point in time. So I am recognizing the time. So I do also want to I know we're scheduled to go for another 20 minutes, but Megan had some really good research that she also wanted to share on her work. So in the college algebra course, which is fundamental to ASU, ASU has never shared the same kind of work that Oregon State did, but I would imagine it's about the same. If we don't get our students through our math courses, we essentially don't get our students through our programs. And ASU actually used 5 years to get to this point of 20% increase in student success. So I do want to emphasize that these are not tools that can easily be launched out of the box without any practice, right? I want to emphasize, but I do want to emphasize the goals of actually reaching this level of success and the methods are known by a few more colleagues across the world, and we can actually look to those colleagues to help us. So yeah, go one more on this, Megan, because what it actually shows is that I think there's a line that shows up on this one. If you just hit the, maybe it's not working. Oh, there it is. Right. So if what you also see is that the differences between student types, that's fine, Megan, you don't have to go back. The differences between student types is also disappearing. And that's actually really important to all of us as well. Megan, I think we want to switch over to Dr. Megan Tesene, who's been running all of our new work, and she can show you what this work is like when you start and then you have COVID around the world. And we can tell you that the news is actually pretty positive. But Megan, why don't you go ahead and share?
Sure, thank you, Karen. And one can have a PhD, but still not know how to stop a slideshow from progressing forward when it's on an automated thing mid-stride. So I appreciate your patience on that front. One thing I did want to also just add, Karen, to the question about working with advanced students in a course, because there's certainly the element of identifying those folks and bumping them along to a more advanced course. But we've also been seeing with faculty is what Karen's been talking about in terms of, you know, this active and adaptive approach. And what we've been seeing is faculty and identifying which students are doing well, which students are not doing well, which ones are intermediate, finding different activities or things to do in the classroom, grouping folks together who are maybe at a more advanced, you know, stage than others. And putting people together in that way, either giving them time together in class or kind of bumping them to focus on other activities that might be more catered to, you know, what their learning needs are at that particular time. So just wanted to add that as well. So I've been working on the adaptive courseware for early success grants. This started in 2018. This was a natural evolution of that first grant that Karen was talking about. So the Gates Foundation funded that one with those 8 institutions and is now working. So APLU, Karen and I are working with 6 universities that are listed here across Texas, Ohio, Florida. We also have a handful of institutions that are in the community college space that are also listed here. Our colleagues at Achieving the Dream do similar work as APLU does in working with these institutions in the 2-year space. One of the benefits of this approach is that this grant is a little bit more collaborative, that we have a network approach. There's several different partners that we work and engage with. And this way we're able to work across institutions and build a community of practitioners, not only the 4-year space, but also the 2-year space. So that question about, you know, working with high schools, for instance, in terms of the transition, one thing that we've done with the benefits of working in the regions is that, you know, what can we do potentially for community college students who are transferring to the 4-year institutions? There's been some efforts to try and collaborate. For instance, in Ohio, some of the Cuyahoga Community College students are working with Cleveland State and how can we use the same type of courseware, same type of structure. So those are the types of conversations that those folks are having. So really this grant is wanted to take what we learned on the first one and put those best practices to use at an accelerated rate. So Karen and I and our colleagues, we work with institutions and teams on the ground to do a course redesign initiative with target courses that have been identified as problematic and that they have high failure rates. So the general goal of this grant was to, work with institutions to, scale out, adopt and implement and scale out the application of these coursewares, but also to see what these practices can do in terms of improving student outcomes, student success rates. What we've also seen, and as Karen's been mentioning multiple times, is that you have this, the implementation takes time in terms of seeing a positive effect, and I'll show some slides in a second in terms of what outcomes we had from this cohort of institutions, but that some of these things can take time. So we do try to build a continuous improvement process into that. We have colleagues at Digital Promise. They are the program evaluators of this, and we've been working with the institutions to actually measure the impact of this and meeting with the faculty and administrators on the ground there to think about, okay, now that we've done one iteration of this, let's think about how we can do it better for the next semester and then the next semester as well. And taking a perspective on teaching and learning that, you don't always have it just right, but you're always kind of fine-tuning your practice and your pedagogy over time in terms of what you're learning. Also that student populations are constantly changing, as well as social and cultural context can change those things as well. But we really wanted to take the work from these institutions, identify additional good practices, build out our community of practitioners and learn from their experiences, and share that with the higher ed landscape, which is something that we're doing today, and sharing what we've learned from this grant with y'all as well. So we have seen, and we do just have 2 semesters of implementation for this grant. We had the fall of 2018, the fall of 2019, as well as this most recent spring term. That was a bit of a bust in terms of data collection, as I'm sure you can imagine, just with COVID happening and a lot of confounding variables with that. But if we do look at the fall term from 2018 to 2019 in these adaptive courses that we implemented in, we did see an improvement in student pass rates. So we use the phrase drop, fail, withdrawal, and incomplete rates, kind of the opposite of success rates. So you'll see that we did see less students were failing those courses and dropping from those courses, and that was across the board for all student groups, in particular because we are very interested in working with marginalized and oppressed minority groups, underserved student groups. We saw a slight decrease in their outcomes as well. Let me just explain what we're looking at here. Our colleagues at Digital Promise helped put this together. This is again from the fall 2019 data. So on the left-hand side, you're going to see a list of different adaptive courseware providers. I'm sure you have maybe some of these. There's some overlap, but there's probably some other technologies that you're working with that we're not working with here in the States. What you have this kind of that line in the center. Anything to the right of that is a positive improvement in that course from the previous year. Anything to the left of that is actually on the negative. Now, anything that's in blue, not significant. Anything in green is listed as a statistically significant impact. So again, as Karen had mentioned, we generally do not see much of an impact in terms of student outcomes in the first semester. So the fact that we did see a couple of statistically significant positive improvements was good, and what we do anticipate in time as we go through this continuous improvement process where faculty are working to, again, improve their pedagogies, learn from each semester in terms of how they might want to modify their instruction for the following term, that we will see these rates improve over time, which is what we saw with that first grant. Now that that was in year 3 or year 4, we're seeing a lot more of a positive effect of that. What I think is important about this slide is that it shows that you'll see, so for instance, Pearson Mastery is listed many, many, many times here. And that is because it's actually across a variety of different disciplines there. So one might be biology, one might be math, one might be chemistry. So what you can see is some of them fall on the positive, some of them fall on the negative. And the point here, what I think is important is that what we often say is it's not necessarily the tool that you use. Obviously, you want to have a high quality tool that provides you with the information that you need and that your students need and guide them in an effective way, but implementation matters, right? So for each of these courses, you had a different type of implementation. And what I mean by that is, you know, usually in the first semester, faculty are just trying to figure out what this new technology is and getting it, you know, put into practice for their students and for themselves. They're not really doing a whole lot to their pedagogy in terms of making any sort of changes to what they're doing in the classroom. Where we do see the more positive effects, so those ones that kind of fall on that right-hand side of that list, is that you'll see that that typically is paired with the active instruction. It's usually paired with a more robust educational ecosystem, for instance, where you have, it's not just the faculty teaching the course, maybe they're also integrating student assistants, teaching assistants are assisting with them. Maybe they actually have advising, working with students. So they're building kind of an ecosystem within their campus to really support those students and the faculty to make sure that they have the support they need to review the data, do interventions that are meaningful for those students as well. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we have several network partners that we're working with on this grant. Digital Promise, I've mentioned them, as well as Titan Partners. They do sort of more market trends research, but what we're learning from them, at least from this group of institutions that we've been working with, is that during COVID, last semester anyway, they've done some focus groups and surveys with faculty and institutions as well as students. But what we're hearing, not only just anecdotally, but through that research, is that the faculty who were part of this project reported a more seamless transition to this new sort of remote situation that we're in. They'd already had some training with teaching with educational technologies. A portion of their course was already online. For some of them, their entire course was online. But it's not just the familiarity with the technology and being online. Part of it was going through a course redesign process, sometimes alone, but usually we worked with a cohort of faculty. So for instance, all of the biology faculty in a particular program had worked together to redesign a course. And kind of going through that process, they had to think about, why am I teaching the way that I'm teaching? How do I prioritize, and what should I be prioritizing in the classroom? And having been through that process, they've definitely indicated that they felt that that helped them make that transition more so than some of their colleagues that had not been through a training program like that. Additionally, we're hearing from faculty that they think that their students made that transition better, as well as that the courseware, when kind of chaos was around them in terms of what their day-to-day lives were looking like in terms of school and life. You know, some people were, you know, now learning from home, sharing computers with their families, that things were kind of up in that regard. But that the courseware had provided some level of stability for them. That stayed the same. They knew what to expect. It provided them the structure that they needed on what should I be focusing on in terms of studying for this course, which also made the FaceTime that they had virtually anyway be more useful. So we are seeing that satisfaction for these courses, again, these adaptive courses, compared to the national average, is that students were reporting a higher level of satisfaction with the quality of instruction being provided in these types of courses. Now, Digital Promise in their survey focused on 8 different practices around how interactive it was, what were the content and activities and assessment practices. So these are just some examples of what those were. And you know, in terms of satisfaction levels, students who felt or identified that basically the more of these eight items, I'm not saying these are the only 8 items that faculty should be doing, but students and faculty reported that these different things were going on in their classroom. The more of them that were, had higher levels of satisfaction with these things happening. And so, in terms of what we're seeing to be kind of the more impactful of those 8 was using real world examples to illustrate course content, sending personal messages to the students. And one of the nice things about some of these adaptive systems is that you can automate it to do that. Not all faculty want to do that. They feel that that's sort of impersonal, even though it's trying to provide a sort of personalized experience. But having some sort of interaction with the students that way, as well as assignments requiring students to reflect on their own learning. Definitely, we've been also hearing about kind of this in terms of, is the content that's being covered, does it resonate with me and my personal experience as a student who's kind of living in this particular world at this time? So again, those 8 practices were sort of shown to be effective in terms of student satisfaction, as well as faculty satisfaction, reporting that they felt that their classes were going well, or that their students were learning, and that their students you know, were really connecting despite everything else that was going on around them. All right, so that's the survey that was from. And again, we'll be sharing these slides. I just want to point out as well that we have these different resources in terms of Every Learner network we've been working with have been providing a variety of different resources that we're developing. This is where you can find them in terms of courseware evaluation and selection. And if you want to start looking at what's available, the EdSurge Product Index is currently the best thing we have out there right now, but we are developing a new evaluation reporting site. And of course, APLU has a guide for implementing adaptive courseware. We are also in the process with our network partners to develop a new one of those. It's going to be an online version, but using any of these links, you should be able to access that information and get some insight on where to start, regardless of where you are in your program at this particular time. Another thing I just want to share is that we do have a couple of different webinar series, not only just faculty focused that are listed here, we also have administrators as well if you want to share those. And these particular these 3 are faculty talking about their redesigns and kind of what that process has looked like and the impact it's been having on student learning. All right, so I know that we didn't leave us a ton of time for questions.
Yeah, we'd left much time for questions, and I just want to apologize. Evidently, I'm out of practice from presenting, but and I do want to encourage you to look at our emails, and we're more than happy to also answer your questions in email. But Dr. Selim, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Karen and Megan. That's very informative, and I think we are, as UAEU, we're standing at a very good point because we're going to be starting adaptive learning and adaptive courseware implementation. And I think we should start planning our research in parallel to that in order not to miss any data. But I have another side that wasn't really touched on during this very informative session. It's regarding the faculty dispositions and competencies in order to be successful in managing and facilitating adaptive course. I think you noticed one of the questions asking about, does that work for large classes and so forth? So the redesign of the course with the rethinking of the teaching pedagogies and the major mindset change that faculty need to go through. I remember a research that was conducted by Charles Graham in Brigham Young University about faculty readiness and higher education institution readiness. But he looked at it from the perspective of blended and online. And I was looking at their model, and I noticed that the dispositions that their research concluded, and these were the maximum or the highest significance rate amongst the different dispositions. One of them is to value data-driven decisions, and the other is to allow more student agency and ownership. While you were talking about the adaptive learning, I just looked at these two dispositions, and we really need to have some faculty development and training workshops for our teaching community to help us to change from a sage on the stage to something else, to be just a facilitator of such courses. Even the competencies that we need to build, we do have very well structured business intelligence systems. Within Blackboard, we can generate long list of real-time reports about student performance and all that. But how can we fit that into our teaching practices is what we need to enhance, because we're going after mega digital learning transformation within our institution. And we would like to make sure that our faculty are enabled and ready to fit into that mega change.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that institutions are just coming up to date with the fact that we have real-time data. In some ways, there are easy comparisons. Those of you that use your Apple Watch or your Fitbit or other things know that you are changing generally, or you're accepting the fact that this is what your data is and I don't want to do anything. So you actually have some knowledge, right? And so we are beginning to notice that doesn't actually mean that it's easy though, right? Like once we have the data, we have to train ourselves. What do we do with the data? Oftentimes that means we have to remember to look at the data the day before we have a class. And that means I need to think about, because of this data, what are the variations of things that I might have to do in the classroom? That's very different than going in with a prepared lecture. And it is a mindset shift, but it is the mindset shift that many of us have expected in our other dealings outside of the world, right? We now expect that people have our data and they treat us as knowing our data, right? And now we have to begin to use that same mindset shift inside of it. And I would say faculty, by and large, if you start with the premise they want their students to be successful, then they understand that this requires rethinking how that success actually happens, right? The more you know, the more I can help an individual overcome a learning issue. That is whether or not there's just difficulty in understanding that concept, or whether something has to be unlearned, as we often know is the case. So when we move into this world, we really do have to think about supporting our faculty. And I would also say with Charles's work, one of the things that we talk about, and the reason we talk about it takes 3 times, that is practice. Practice at doing this is just as important for the faculty as it is for the students. So I think you as an institution need to think about what that means for these faculty that are willing to do this work. And for faculty, we have to hold ourselves not at the highest standard the first time that we do this, but at a standard that says, I am working towards a new methodology. Therefore, I have to give myself time to practice this methodology.
Well, I've enjoyed the your webinar. I've enjoyed your research, and I got a copy of the report that was published about the other case studies of other institutions that you included in your studies, that I'm sure that we will benefit from them. And I hope this is the beginning of seeing you more in our future webinars. And I'm going to be looking forward for that plan of building the competencies that we might see fit into our transformation. Thank you very much, everyone, and looking forward to see you in our future webinars. Thank you very much.